It is often said that young people simply do not care about politics at all. As a result, it is them who are getting blamed for the fact that our countries are currently run by one of the oldest cohort of politicians in modern history. But is it really a correct assessment? And what can be done to get the younger generations more involved in public space? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wide the View. Western politics, both in Europe and the US, is frequently labeled as gerontocratic, that is, governed by old people. In other words, it is more and more apparent that age is becoming the key criterion in electing our leaders, but maybe not in the way we would like it to work. Young political talent is hard to find, as the best and brightest of new generations prefer the comfort and hefty salaries of the private sector. But this is only true to some degree. While the presence of an army of 70 and 60-year-old leaders at the very top of politics may raise some concerns, younger leaders do emerge, occasionally. Similarly, however, to younger voters, they tend to represent more radical positions on the ideological spectrum. So, what is the generational divide in European politics really about? Let's find out in this report.
Age is shaping up to be a key issue in this year's US presidential race. Joe Biden, the 81-year-old incumbent, will vie for a second term against 78-year-old Donald Trump. It marks the oldest ever rivalry for the top job in American politics. In Europe, the numbers aren't quite as extreme, but our aging leadership remains a political concern. In Brussels, two key positions in the new term will most likely be held by politicians over 60. Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa belong to the same age cohort as Germany's Olaf Scholz and Prime Minister of Poland Donald Tusk. And in the outgoing European Parliament, the age of the average lawmaker was 54. The oldest sitting MEP was Mercedes Bresso of Italy's Democratic Party, aged 79. She was often contrasted with the youngest EU legislator, Kira Marie Peter Hansen, who won her seat with the Greens at the age of 21. The vast majority of European Parliament members were between 41 and 60. Only a handful of them belonged to younger generations, being in their 20s and 30s. But that's not to say that young Europeans lack political role models. The National Rally's 28-year-old leader, Jordan Bardella, spent the last 5 years in Brussels. Now, he's the poster boy of the French far-right and hopes to unseat Emmanuel Macron as leader of the nation. His meteoric rise through the party ranks is a sign of dissatisfaction with generational divisions in Europe. Younger voters are growing tired of old-school politics, and they're electing leaders who promise to put an end to it.
Is politics failing young people? Or maybe it is the European youth who are simply disinterested in public engagement at all? As usual on our show, very difficult question, but luckily we have a panel of three esteemed experts with us tonight to answer that very question. Andrea Gerosa, founder of Think Young, a Brussels-based think tank. Reto Mitteregger, doctoral candidate at the University of Zurich, and Maria Rodriguez Alcazar, president of the European Youth Forum. Good evening. I want to begin with you, Andrea, and pose you with a rather general question. You've been involved in youth empowerment for over a decade, and if I present you with a statement that, frankly speaking, the European youth in Western democracies do not care that much about politics, what would be your answer?
That it's a half-truth in the sense that they care about politics and they care about engagement, but they just do it in a different way. They do what is called engaging with social causes, like getting involved in non-profit organization. They do it like with activism. They do it like with what is boycotting and what is boycotting, meaning avoiding to buying something, that's boycotting, or using your purchasing power to support a cause. We do extensive surveys and research on young people, and all the data tell us that that's how they see the political engagement. So they do have a strong involvement in politics at large, meaning benefiting society, and they do it, as I said before, with involvement in non-profit and other activities. But just the traditional political scheme and the traditional political parties, they are definitely away from them, yes.
And could you elaborate on that a little bit? Is that engagement, especially under the form of boycotts or the non-traditional forms, sporadic, or is it something that happens on regular basis among the same group of young people?
From what we see, it happens on regular basis. The question is that this is a generation that also, and you see it then in how they vote, they're not super loyal as probably previous generation to one political party, also because there's no more strong ideologies like there was before, center right, center left, etc., etc. So they voted, for example, massively for the Greens at the last European election. This time they didn't. And the same thing they do when it comes to activism. They might join a cause. We saw in the US, Black Lives Matter, it was massive. It really changed a lot in society. It helped to have an impact. And not only political parties and politicians were listening and taking action, companies, which we know are an important player of society, also heard that and participated. So that they do have not just the engagement in a different way, but also an impact in a different way. It's just if we just look at with the point of view of what it was 20, 50 years ago, then no, that's just completely different, and that's and that it's good as well.
We're going to talk about the comparisons over time in just a minute, but I want to bring you, Reto, into that discussion. We got a general picture from Andrea. Now, what does political science say about that in a more data-driven perspective? What are the main drivers, if you could elaborate, of public engagement, political engagement for the younger voters, and how do they differ, if they differ at all, compared to older generations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really established finding in political science, that older voters vote more often than young voters. And this has mainly three reasons. So we know young voters often lack skills, political skills. They're often not as informed as older voters about how politics work, so to say. They do not know parties that well. They have not just had that many chances to vote as older voters had. But there are also other reasons. So we know, for example, that young voters are not as mobilized as often as older voters. So political parties, we have seen the examples of Joe Biden or Donald Trump, often do not really try to capture young voters. And that's an important factor, as recent research just has shown. If political parties have young leaders, young people turn out to vote more often.
And I kind of want to follow up on that a little bit, because on the one hand, that seems to be entirely true that we have, especially the well-established traditional centrist parties that fail to capture the younger vote. But if any political actor happens to be successful in that process, usually more extreme groups, whether that's more often in Europe is actually far right, but the far left groups are not short of successes in that field as well. Why is that the case?
Well, I think it has just been said before. There is a strong trend of newer generations going away from the traditional parties. In Europe, those were social democrats or Christian democratic parties. And we see really strong and robust trends that now newer generations are not voting for those parties anymore. They're not engaged in those parties anymore. And I think there we shouldn't forget that not only parties have lost young voters, or those center parties, but also other organizations, trade unions, or religious associations. There we do rarely find any young people that are left in those organizations. And those organizations were strongly tied to those political parties in the center, center left, center right, and that we just do not see as strongly anymore. And if I can make a final point, I think there's also a tendency that we see that young voters are not set yet in their ways and compared to older voters. So they might also change from one election to another more frequently than older voters because they have not established ties yet to one specific party. That's
And
also
I think
something
that's
that
very much, I'm going to interrupt you here for a little bit. I think that's very much reflected in the data that we have, especially from the last European Parliament elections. But now I want to invite you, Maria, into that discussion and ask you about more case study-based perspective. In your capacity as the president of European Youth Forum, you interact with younger people from all over the continent. Do you see any regional or even national differences in drivers of mobilization, drivers of interest between the youth from different parts of Europe?
Well, thank you for this invitation first. And to be honest, we are still analyzing the results of the European Parliament elections in terms of voting patterns for young people. It's not that we have the full information on how it was for all the countries. But regarding participation in general, and we saw already with the Eurobarometer that was conducted before the elections. So in May, there was already explained the intention of vote of young people. And we can see that it's more or less similar all across Europe. So it's not a very regional pattern. So we cannot say that there is less interest in East Europe or more interest somewhere else, because that's not really the case. The data, for example, that we had on the intention to vote in the elections for young people in Poland, it was 69%. That was higher than the average of young people all across the EU. And in other countries, it was like more or less around 60 and 50%. So we cannot really say that there is this pattern, but it's true that the spaces for young people to participate in society, so the civic space has shrunk all across Europe. So we are seeing this shrinkage of civic space. And young people are affected by this. And this is something that unfortunately we have seen more in Eastern Europe, but this is something that is happening all across the continent nowadays. With this, I'm meaning that young people, we no longer have that many spaces to just simply assembly, that many times youth organizations, we don't have the financial means to conduct our activity, but also that some youth organizations, they are having retributions or that they are having repercussions for politically having their stance when they are against the governments.
So it's not just all politics when explaining politics, it seems. Thank you very much all for this bird's eye view and diagnosis in our first part of the discussion. Now let's move to the second segment of our show, in which we will try to examine whether there is really a strong link between younger voters and political extremism, and to what extent it actually poses a threat. According to the data provided by Eurobarometer, as much as 62% of young voters took part in the last European Parliament elections. And while their high participation is certainly encouraging, their political preferences indicate major grievances. France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal were, among others, the countries which saw most young voters swinging towards far-right groups. So, is there really a link between European youth and Eurosceptic extremism? Let's find out in this report.
France is by far the most visible example of young people's dissatisfaction with centrist politics. The far-right National Rally won over 31% of support among voters aged 18 to 25. The second most popular party in that age group was the far-left France Unbowed with 17%. Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance was backed only by 6% of the youngest voters. In Germany, as many as 15% of them cast their ballots for AfD, but the Radical Party is far more popular among men than women. A very similar tendency can be seen in Belgium, where young men decisively back the main anti-immigration party, Flemish Interest. In Finland, the right-wing Finns party finished second overall in the recent European vote. But if you exclude voters of 65, the Finns party would have won by a landslide. The result of the far-right Portuguese party, Chega, was also highest among the youth. When it comes to youngest Europeans and their politics, two trends are clear. They clearly prefer divisive rhetoric and controversial political programs. Their disillusionment with centrist parties is visible everywhere on the continent. But they are also a very complex and diverse group of voters. Young European men unquestionably support parties that promise to put an end to mass immigration. They're also more socially conservative and oppose progressive policies. Young women, in turn, still prefer parties on the left, even the more radical ones. The division among generations certainly persists, but soon a new one between men and women may become equally relevant to European politics.
So, Reto, as we've just seen, it seems to be a trend all over Europe that we have younger voters drawn to more extremist parties. As we've just discussed, it's much more often on the far right than far left, but far left is also not short of successes in that age group. Why is that the case? Is this proverbial rebel vote of younger people who just rebel against the ancien regime and the politics of the old? Or is there a deeper meaning, particularly in this new wave of far right triumphs?
Well, I would be a bit careful with the general empiric assessment. That trend is visible in some countries. Yes, we see it, for example, in Sweden quite strongly, in Spain, in Portugal. But for example, in Italy or in Austria, where the far right did very well in the recent European elections, they were not particularly successful among young voters. I think that is important to say that there are some regional differences. However, there is a trend. Young voters seem to have voted against the parties that were in government. We've seen that strongly in Germany. We've seen that in France, but also in other contexts. I think that is an important pattern that we saw. Second, I think young people care about other issues than the big centrist parties propose on the agenda. We've heard about immigration, but 5 years ago climate was a big issue for young voters, but also living costs that are not addressed, especially rent prices in cities that mostly affect young voters, and that young vote against established parties, be it far left or in some countries far right, is also a sign of discontent in times of crisis.
But discontent has always been, to a certain extent, a feature of younger politics. So has anything changed to the degree to which, in France, for instance, we have the two most extreme parties being the two most popular among the younger voters? And that's not just the only country where that happens.
Yeah, something has changed. And I think one important pattern that has changed is young voters nowadays are not tied to a specific party, as we have heard before. So they have multiple parties that they think could be electable options, for example. And what we also see is young voters tend to see parties on the extremes as more electable. Why is that the case? One important reason here is those parties have just become more normal. The Front National, as it in the 90s, was still a fringe, dangerous party in France. But the 90s are almost 30 years ago. So a lot of has changed. So those parties have now become established forces, serious political opponents, and young voters grow up in such a political climate where those parties are not pariah parties, as they were called back in the days, anymore. The same is happening to some extent in Germany, but also in other countries.
Maria, I want to move to you right now and kind of follow up on what Reto was saying, but with a different lens in mind. Because parallel to the divide between the older and younger voters, we see another one emerging, the gender-based one. So we clearly see younger men voting more conservative, socially conservative groups, especially in Europe, whilst younger women tend to stick either to mainstream left-wing parties, the Greens, or even some more extreme left-wing feminist groups and agendas. Do you think that this is going to be a feature, a persisting feature of European politics from now on, that gender-based divide between the younger people?
Well, I hope it won't, but it's true that we are seeing this in the current generation, and there are many statistics in different countries also showing this pattern that men are voting more for anti-feminist approaches, while women, they are more socially open in that case. But again, this is we don't really have the information all across Europe, so it's also early to talk about, even in these elections, how young people perform there. But what is important as well to mention is how this is going to affect democracy in general, the voting patterns of young people. What we have been asking to the different political parties ahead of the European Parliament elections is to have more representation of the challenges that young people are facing, that they need really to pay attention to the different demands that we have, the proposals that we have, and that they need to engage more with younger audiences. The issue that we are seeing
So
is
why
that
are they failing, do you think?
What, sorry?
Why are they failing in that engagement?
Yeah, when we have been spreading the word about the elections, many young people, they told us, why should I vote? Why is my vote going to change anything? And the truth is that way too often we feel that institutions, they are not delivering for us, that they are not doing enough to change the issues of our day-to-day life. So it's more about talking about the issues of young people, but also having more young people in the decision-making position. We were seeing before that there are not that many members of the European Parliament or people that are making decisions at the highest level that are kind of young and can also bring our concerns. So that's something that we would want to see. Again, it's a bit early to say, but it seems that this time there will be more young people at the European Parliament. Last time there were the same amount of young people as people called Martin. That was in total 7 people at the European Parliament. So that's something that needs to change. And young people, we want to see in institutions that our demands, our concerns, our challenges of our day-to-day life are actually brought, addressed, and there are practical solutions that are put into place.
Mm-hmm. And Andrea, how important are social media platforms in all this? Because we know that younger people disproportionately often get their information also about politics from social media, especially TikTok. And we also have empirical evidence that especially the extreme parties are way more active on TikTok compared to mainstream centrist politicians. How does social media evolution or revolution rather play into that game?
Well, they play a very strong role, like any new media has played in the history of human being. When TV came, the parties that were able to surf on TV, they managed to capture a lot of vote, and was the same with radio, was the same with printed press, and today it's the same with social media. But I wouldn't specifically look at social media as a scapegoat to say we lost because of social media. No, as Maria said, some parties lost appeal because they're not addressing some issues and they're not putting up younger face. As Reto said, some parties in some regions are actually gaining the vote of young people. But it's true that, social media plays a strong role because that's where young people are not so young one anymore. Also people that are, the Gen Y, they're all in their 40s. They consume information and they learn about things on platforms that are out there. So, and that's one part of the answer, I would say, for social media. The second part, you mentioned TikTok. Of course, if you put yourself in the shoes probably of a traditional party, you spent a lot of money and a lot of budget learning other platforms in the last 10 years. When the new platform came in, maybe they underestimated because other platforms were there and not so popular. I'm thinking about Snap, for example. They might have made some investment. It didn't work out. There is TikTok coming. Is it good? Is it bad? It's easier for a smaller party to be flexible and jump on a new one. And it turned out that was a good bet. And also you have younger member of a party or a younger politician that are probably more in what is the right or the left parties, and they are smarter at using them. But again, I think we are really making a big mistake if we think of social media as a scapegoat, and we're not doing a favor or a service to young people, just diminishing everything. Democracy, do we believe in it? Yes, of course. Do we stand by democracy? Yes, of course. Have young people voted and spoken? Yes. Let's understand why and what are they asking.
Challenging times ahead for everybody, especially those of our political class members who are not perhaps so fluent in social media and conversing with the younger audience. Andrea Gerosa, Reto Mitteregger, Maria Rodriguez Alcazar, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Younger voters are not so much disinterested in politics as it simply has a different meaning for them. They still expect governments to solve their problems and see the state as an important actor in their everyday lives. Getting them on board is a challenge, especially for the parties of the center. But governing without them will be impossible. After all, the youth is the future, also in politics. Thank you for being with us tonight. Make sure to tune in next Thursday when we will examine the contentious relationship between Europe and China. Good night.